Now, unlike some of the straight seams that we'll be experiencing in chapters 4 and 5 and so on, a dart is actually a shaping seam, which means that it takes out more at one end than it does at the other. So all three of these jackets have examples of darts. Often it's around the waist because people have more of a circumference around their chest and hips than they do on their waist, and so often we'll use shaping seams or darts to accommodate that. So as you guys saw on the mannequins, darts don't actually go all the way up the body of the garment. So in this case, we have two little sample darts, and you'll each cut out one of your pattern pieces, which is a mini bodice, so the front of a dress or a jacket top. And so first things first, we have our little dart legs here on the two sides, and then you're going to take a pencil and you're just going to bore through the paper in order to give yourself the end of your dart. So that way when you go to transfer your information to the fabric, you can actually draw that in. So I'm going to pin through my pattern piece into the paper, making sure that I'm keeping the center line on grain, so in line with this edge of the fabric, this fuzzy edge, or you can actually follow kind of the grid of the fabric. I'm just going to pin it in place so I don't lose my place while I'm tracing the circumference, which will become my stitching line. So once it's all steady, I'll use my fabric marking pencil. I'm just going to run along the edge of my pattern piece here. It's important to keep your work near where you're drawing, otherwise the paper could move, or you could draw underneath by accident, but you're just legitimately tracing this out. And I'm marking my center line here and on the bottom just for a reference point. And you can see there, I actually drew a little bit underneath my pattern piece, so I'm going to fix that in a moment. Now before I unpin anything, I'm going to mark the top of my darts, just by giving myself a little dot. And then I'll mark the two ends of the legs, because in that way I know where I'll fold my fabric to make my dart once I'm ready. All right. Now I'm not just going to cut this out, because then I wouldn't have any seam allowance. This would become, if I were to make this into a real, tiny little thing, I would eventually stitch on those lines, but you need to have fabric beyond that in order to have a seam allowance to hold on to it. So using your mini grid rulers, you're going to trace a 5/8 seam allowance. So this is a 1-inch ruler, which has 8 1/8 to make that up. So 5/8 is just 5 little boxes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. One line just beyond the first thick line. So if you line that up, if I line out the 5/8 line on my stitch line, and then I can rule a line, then I've actually made a 5-inch seam allowance from that edge. So you're just going to add 5/8 all the way around. So in this case, I'm holding the ruler steady. I'm trying to keep a nice straight line. I'll do all of my straight lines first, but you can go in whichever order you want. The important thing is that you're just doing 5/8 all the way around. Oh, see, I made a mistake there, so I'm going to cross that out, get my line to be a little bit more even. And then for these curved lines, you can use the edge of your ruler. Again, if you count 5 boxes in from that edge, and then just give yourself little dash marks, always perpendicularly to your 5/8 line. And then you can fill that in, because really you'll just be cutting on that line. And then lastly, you'll mark your darts themselves. So connecting from that point that you drew at the top, connecting it down to those little markings you made on the hem. So once you have your stitch lines drawn and then your cut line drawn, you can go ahead and cut out your fabric with your fabric scissors. And then before you're ready to stitch, you're going to pin your darts in place. So really, like any of the other seams we're working on, you'll pin your seam lines so that they intersect. So I'm going through where my dart leg intersects with that bottom line, and I'm going to come out on the other side in the same place. So I'll set that one first, and then I'll pivot so that I come back through the top side of the fabric, and then I'll pinch the fabric right on that dot where the end of the dart is. So then that way, that seam is going to go to nothing. It'll go down to 0. And then I'll put one more pin in just to make sure that I haven't lost all of my edges lining up. And then I'll do this side. So remember, this was a mistake, so I'm aiming for this lower line right here. So I'll pin both my darts together because they're far enough apart that one shouldn't interfere with the other while I'm stitching. And then once I'm pinned, I'm ready for stitching. And now that your darts are pinned, you want to make sure your machine is set on certain parameters so that your zigzag is turned all the way to the left to 0 to make sure it has a straight stitch, that your needle placement is pointing straight up, so then that way your needle is lined up with the cut on your presser foot for center placement, and you'll make sure that your stitch length is set at 3 for a stay stitch. Unlike our Chapter 3 samples, with darts, the stitch actually doesn't go all the way down the garment, so we're only going to backstitch with the machine at the very beginning of it. We won't backstitch at the end, otherwise it could make a little weird mess. So at the very end, you're actually going to leave a long tail, and then we'll finish that by hand with a hand needle afterwards. So I'm lowering my presser foot with the presser foot lever back here. I'll take those first few stitches. I've made sure that my needle is going to hit right at the very beginning of that line, and I'll backstitch just a little bit to start. And then in this case, I'll get all the way off the end of the fabric. I'm going to make sure that my uptake lever is all the way up, and I've moved the hand wheel to make sure of that. Then I can lift the presser foot and pull it away and trim those threads, leaving a nice long tail. And then I'll go and do the same on the opposite side. Then once you have your darts sewn, we're going to trim off these thread tails right close to the fabric. But these ones, since we haven't actually finished those yet, what you'll do is you'll trim them so that they're nice and even together and not fuzzy. And then you'll thread both of these through a needle. And then once you're done, right in this little peak of your dart, you'll take a small stitch. Before you pull it tight, you will go back through that loop twice to create a double locking stitch. And this is how we begin and end all of our stitch work. So I'll do one more just to make sure it's safe. So I'm going through the loop and then back through again. Now if I were just to cut my thread right there, it might be a little bit wobbly. It might undo the knot. So right next to where I did my knot, I'm going to go back into the dart, and right now I'm just running my needle along that folded edge. So then that way, when I pull this tight, I've actually hidden a 1/4 inch of tail within the dart that you won't see from the outside either. And then you can trim your thread tail. For those of you who might struggle bust like I was when it came to threading 2 threads through a needle, I also want to show you these needle threaders that are in your kits. So you have these little metal loops that you will poke through the eye of the needle. So then that way your needle is kind of caught on it, and that's a bigger eye to deal with. So now I can take my 2 pieces of thread and I can put them through my needle threader. So then that way that's holding my thread in place, and then I can pull that through my needle, and that's a faster way that you can get your needles threaded. So if we were just to iron this flat on the table, you see how you get this weird little ruffle right here? Because essentially a dart is making something into a curved surface to fit around the body. And so actually we're going to use this piece, it's called a ham, and it's actually a sawdust filled piece of fabric that allows for us to make things ironed on a curve. So for this you're going to find the curve that works, you're going to kind of fit it around. So in this case for me, I'm able to get it kind of right on the side. So trying to avoid making a crease where that dart is. And so for directionality, we're going to press our darts so that the seam allowances point in. And then I'll place it to the right side. And see how I've made some little dents right there? I'm going to go ahead and fix those from the right side. So I'll line this up. The size of your buttonhole is determined by the size of your button, but just to give you guys a close-up, as I know you all have buttonholes on your own garments, so take a look right now if you happen to have one. But in this case, this is a machine-made buttonhole that has 6 parts. And so what you can see is there's a set of satin stitching down each side of the buttonhole, and then a bar tack on top is what finishes off the top and bottom of it. Often there are guide stitches that start the shape of the rectangle, and so it's the guide stitch, satin stitch, and bar tack on both sides that make up the 6 different steps of a buttonhole. Depending on your button size, that will dictate the size of the buttonhole you have to make. To find that out, you'll take your button and you'll measure it and find the widest point, or the diameter. So in this case it's 1 inch, and then to that you're going to add 1 more 1/8 of an inch to allow for some ease of getting your button to the buttonhole. However, if you have buttons like these that are called shank buttons because they have a little bit of height behind them, or something as ridiculous as this, which is very tall, you actually have to add a little bit more, either a full 1/4 inch to allow for the height of this to go through. However, these are crazy pants. So we're just going to worry about this button for today. So our measurement was 1 inch and 1/8. And so you'll give yourself a few markings on your sample piece just so that you can practice. So for now I'll start in the middle, and as I practice I might add more. But with my ruler I'll draw a straight line that is 1 inch and 1/8. So that equals 8 1/8 boxes to make up the inch plus 1 more, so 9 little 1/8 boxes. And then I'll give myself a little leg at the beginning and the end. So I'm basically making a little eye shape. And then we'll take that to the machine and I'll set up the machine for those next steps. Before we stitch our buttonhole, we actually need to change out this foot. So using at the very back, there's a little wishbone shaped claw. We're going to lift that and you're going to pull off your presser foot. For some of you, you might have this type of presser foot that has a red button that actually will allow you to pull off the foot entirely. So you would keep this and then just change out your different feet. So depending on your machine, you might have the type that has the change of outable feet or the kind that's all in one piece. It won't really matter, but the important thing is that you're going to put on what's called the number 3 foot, which is the buttonhole foot. For the buttonhole, we'll be eventually using our buttonhole knob right here to do the 6 different steps that it takes to do a buttonhole. But first we have to set our stitch length. So turning the knob all the way to the right, I'll go until it can't turn anymore, and then I'll bring it down just a little bit to the left to make sure that it's sitting below the line of 0. The point is that we're aiming to hit at this little satin stitch marker, all these little vertical lines together. And then when I move the knob over to 1, you'll see some of these things will shift. It'll adjust the needle placement. It may move the zigzag depending on which step we're on, because that will make the 6 different steps of a guide stitch down one side, a back stitch up the other or a zigzag, a bar tack on the top, a zigzag down the opposite side, a bar tack at the bottom, and then a guide stitch back up to the beginning point. So I'm going to center my buttonhole so that that center foot is lined up with my buttonhole edge, and I'll turn my knob to 1. So you'll see how it changed it to be a 1 3/4 almost, and it moved my buttonhole or my needle placement. So just like the other stitches, I'm going to hold on to my thread just for the very beginning, and we're going to work our way down. So I'll move the hand wheel to finish completing that stitch, and my uptake lever's all the way up. I'm not going to move my fabric, because once I moved to step 2, that's actually going to adjust all the settings that I need to work on. And you'll see that the machine will now control and do the next leg of the buttonhole. So that one brought me all the way back up to the top, so you can see how I zigzag down the side. And now I've gone all the way back up to the top. I'll complete this stitch by moving my hand wheel towards myself, so then that way that stitch is completed. And that's one of the reasons why this foot is different than the regular 0 or 1 foot. It has a large window so that you can see what's happening. But now I'll turn to step 3. And that one did the bar tack across the top of the buttonhole, so it's not too long. Step 4. Completed that one and did the zigzag all the way down my buttonhole, so change to step 5. This one will do the bar tack on the bottom. So you can see it didn't really move in place. It's really just giving an end cap to that buttonhole. But I'll complete that stitch, making sure my uptake lever is all the way up, and then I'll change to 6. And that will bring a guide stitch all the way back up to finish the circumference of the button. And then once it's completed, I'll lift my presser foot and I can trim my threads. So first thing to do, just for neatness' sake, is we're going to trim our thread tails right close to the fabric on both the front and the back. And then we're going to open up our buttonhole. We don't use scissors because it's really, really sad if you actually cut your bar tack at the top or at the bottom. And so we actually use our seam ripper. So to start, you're going to go at one of the ends and you're going to pierce your seam ripper through all layers. And so right now, I've hooked through all layers, but I'm going in between the stitches. And keeping my hand nice and straight, I'm going to cut to the center point. So go slow. You want to make sure that you don't accidentally go off to the side. And then once I've gone about halfway through, then I'll start at the opposite end. I'll get the pick of my my seam ripper in there, and then I'll move forward, cutting through the fabric in the middle, not through the stitches. And then you can see we have a nice open buttonhole. Obviously, for neatness' sake, you might want to trim or groom any of those little guys, or pull them out. I find it helpful to turn the buttonhole on end, so then that way I don't accidentally cut something I don't want to, including my finger. And once you're done, you can test, and you can see how it goes through easily, but not so easily that it would pop out again afterwards.